about. He's originally from San Francisco, but he left 3 years ago to become a digital nomad. And in case you don't know it, he's been living here in the Philippines for the last year and a half. He'll be talking about starter applications and popular gems for Rails. Please give a warm welcome to Daniel Kehoe.
Okay. Wi-Fi. I'm using this cool application for slides called slides.com, and it's got this really cool thing where I can use my phone as the clicker to change the slides, but my phone needs Wi-Fi first. So, yeah, it works. Excellent. So, starter applications. I'll mention my book first. Thank you, Christopher, for mentioning. It's for beginners. Mike Hartle's got a great book called The Rails Tutorial, which is really useful for people who've got some experience programming, who are coming to web development with Rails. I wrote this book because it provides some more basic concepts for people who are beginning their journey with web application development. Provide some context and background before you get into a book like Hartle's tutorial, which is excellent. So if you know someone getting started with Rails, this is a good thing to know about, something that you can recommend to them, get up to speed. And I wrote it because I want to get more people involved in our community. This has been a significant part of my life for many years, and I'd like to have the opportunity to introduce more people to it. So that's why the book exists. But we're going to talk about starter applications. So what are starter applications? It's the basic application that you might build before you get started with customized features for a particular need, for a particular project. It's the Rails application that we build over and over again, the Rails application that we need whenever we begin a new project. And typically that will take a few minutes or might take a few hours by the time we install authentication and authorization, front-end framework, testing framework, make a series of choices, add a few gems. And when we're doing that, we may be starting to wonder, why are we reinventing the wheel? Why are we doing the same project, the same basic setup tasks over and over again? It gets time-consuming, it gets boring, and at that point, programmers are lazy. I think we're lazy for good reason. We're lazy because we want to be efficient. We're lazy because we want to get the most creative value for our effort. And that's where we tend to look for the opportunity to reuse code. So people will start building their basic templates that they might use over and over again. The reason they might be using a starter application, first of all, yes, saves time. Secondly, developers might say it reduces cognitive load, which is a fancy way of saying there's less to think about. You could focus on the features that you want to add to your custom project rather than setting up your basic Rails application. It can be a way of keeping up to date with current Rails practices. Rails changes, as you know, every year and a half with a new major release with 5.2, which is a release candidate right now. We are losing the familiar way of setting configuration variables with the secrets file. There's new credentialing, encrypted credentialing program. Christopher Rigger actually wrote a great blog post for EngineYard about this new 5.2 feature for configuration variables, credentialing. 5.1 Rails, we lost jQuery, which created problems for people who were using the Bootstrap front-end framework. We ended up with a new way of doing forms. And so every year and a half, at least, we're seeing new ways of approaching Rails. And if you've been working on one older Rails application for a while, and you're starting a new one, you might wonder, what's the current best way to approach a new Rails application? What are we supposed to be doing new? And a good, well-maintained starter application will show you if there's been community support for keeping it up to date and current. And the last reason you might be looking at starter applications is gems. What are the gems that are most popular? What are the gems? If you're just starting to get into Rails, this is very much a talk for beginners as well as people who've been using Rails for a while. What are the gems that are most popular? What are the gems that people use the most often? You can take a look at some starter applications and see what are the gems that end up in Rails applications most often. The use case, who needs starter apps? Well, I'll tell you, the person who probably isn't using starter applications very often is the person who's working on a legacy project. If you're part of a team, larger team in a larger company, you've got a Rails application that's been around a while, you do some maintenance on it, you contribute bits and pieces, you add some features to it, you're probably not spinning up new Rails applications very often. But if you're working for a consulting firm, in a dev shop, if you're a consultant on your own, you may be spinning up new Rails applications often, every few weeks, maybe more often than that. If you've got an idea for a side project, wake up in the middle of the night on the weekend and thinking, hey, this is a great thing, maybe I can make some money with this, or this solves a particular problem that I'd like. I think I could build a Rails application to do that. But then you might think, but by the time I set up a Rails application, it'll be a couple of hours, and I'm not sure I have the time this weekend to do it. Well, starter application may get you over that hump. Starter application, you may, in the space of a couple of minutes, eliminate all the basics and be able to focus immediately on the features that are going to lead to that MVP for this next startup that you're going to do. So, doing side projects. Students. I have this debate with people sometimes about whether starter applications are good with students, because the benefit, and probably a reason that a student might want to use it, is you can show somebody how to build a starter application and they can immediately get a pretty powerful, fully functional Rails application. It gives a lot of satisfaction, gives a lot of motivation to continue to dive into Rails and learn more. Personally, I feel students should be building their Rails applications from scratch, but there's an argument to be made. Build a starter application and then go back and look how it was built to get to familiar with current practices in Rails. So this is a starter application that everyone in the room, if you've ever built a Rails project, has used. Rails New is, we call it, a basic Rails project or something like that, but really it's a starter application, it's just a term for it. It gives you a very, very basic bare bones Rails application. It shows you that Rails is up and running and delivering a web page. And bare bones is really the word for it. There's probably a lot more you would want to add. You would want to add authentication, authorization, front-end framework, testing framework. So that's where you're looking for maybe some contributions that other people in the community have made. And you might find them here, ThoughtBot. ThoughtBot's a well-known, well-regarded consulting firm in the US. And they are probably building new Rails applications every couple of days at least, and they've saved time for themselves by standardizing, also standardizing across their company so that everybody's familiar with the basic application that they build. If you go to their GitHub repository, they've got a project called Suspenders, and you can simply use git clone to install it on your local computer. Take a look at it, get the benefit of a very well-regarded consulting firm's expertise and how they go about setting up a Rails application. You could actually just go through, do search and replace in your text editor for Suspenders and replace it with the name of your application and be up and running with a highly functional, solid, basic Rails application there. So git clone, that's an easy way to do it, but there's still that search and replace, and basically you're buying into the ThoughtBot's particular configuration, their particular opinions, their particular preferences for a Rails application. There's a developer in New York, Nick, who's got this project called ORATs, and it's not a repository you'd clone, it's a gem you'll install. And the gem, similar to ThoughtBot Suspenders, generates a complete Rails application. In this case, it actually installs it into a Docker container. So if you're using Docker to create a sandbox for your development environment, you're familiar with Docker, particular choices that Nick has made may be informative for you or maybe useful for you. The limitation here is that you're pretty much stuck with one developer's own set of personal preferences. It doesn't really give you a menu of choices to use. So I watch Reddit pretty regularly, the Rails subreddit, the forum where a lot of developers announce new projects, and every couple of months I'll see somebody announcing a new starter application, kind of like this one. Because everybody needs to scratch that itch. Everybody notices that after a while, yeah, I'm building the same application over and over again, builds a really useful one that they think they'll be using, their own template, and then announces to the world, hey, come and get it, maybe make some contributions or suggestions. And they'll usually last, and this is the drawback, unless it gains a lot of community traction, the project usually gets abandoned within a year and a half or so when the next version of Rails comes around, unless it's somebody who's got enough time to really work on maintaining that application. So starter applications kind of come and go. One that's been around for a while is the project I've worked on, which is Rails Composer, and it's gotten a lot of love from the community. It's been around for, I think, over 6 years now. It's a starter application that's based on the command line, and it gives you a menu of choices, which I will show you in a minute. But we call it a starter application on steroids. Probably the reason it's stuck around because a lot of people use it. And as people use it, they find problems and they contribute issues on GitHub, or sometimes if I'm lucky, they'll contribute patches, pull requests. So it stays fairly well maintained. You can try it out if it's not up to date and current. Hey, hit me up with a GitHub issue, even better, a patch, let me know. I'm always around to help guide people through keeping the application up to date. It works just like the Rails new command. Rails new, give it the name of your application, but then the core maintainers of Rails early on had this brilliant idea that they would make a way to customize the basic Rails application. So you can pass this -m flag to it and either the name of a file or a URL for a file, and the Rails gem itself will use that, basically a script, to generate customized new Rails application. So in this case, Rails Composer is actually just a very, very long Ruby script that lives on GitHub as a file in a repo, and we pass it this particular URL. I got started building this just before I came up with the stage. I've actually got a built application that I'll show you in a couple of minutes, but I'll show you the steps that I went through right before while Sam was talking. And you can do it yourself if you want. Just go to the railscomposer.com webpage. You can copy and paste that particular command and follow along and build it yourself. So it gives you either a choice, custom choices from menus, or it gives you some pre-assembled Rails applications, a dozen of them. I'm going to show you one that I built called Rails Devise Roles. It includes authentication with Devise, so that you've got user login, user logout, user management, and it's got a simple role-based authorization system, as well as front-end frameworks. You'll see what we've got. First choice is a web server for development. Puma is standard default choice now for Rails since 5.1. We use the same one for production, and just for this, since it's the local computer here, I'm going to use SQLite for our database. You could also use Postgres or MySQL. I'm going to use the template engine ERB because it's most familiar to people, but if you want to save, if you prefer saving some keystrokes with your view files when you're doing your HTML, you could choose Camel or Slim as a choice. Test framework, you could just go with the basic mini test, or, thanks Sam, we could use RSpec. And continuous testing, if you want every time to save a file or to run testing, you could choose guard as an option. In this case, I just chose none. And front-end frameworks gives you a choice of a few. There's a few more now. I'd love to include some of the newer front-end frameworks that people are using, like Roma. But we've got Bootstrap 4.0, which Rails Composer doesn't fully support yet because it's fairly new. I'm going to choose Bootstrap 3.3 in this case, in which case we get quite a few pre-assembled templates for the front end that we can use. And we're going to choose Gmail as a way to send email. You could choose a couple of other services if you prefer. We're going to install Devise, which is an authentication framework that gives us login and logout. Most applications need that. Some of you may have used gems in the past, Rails admin or active admin. These are gems, and a newer version is thoughtbot administrate. I've had trouble with the Rails admin and active admin not always being up to date and maintained, so they're not in Rails Composer at this point. But this is something that gives you basic access to your database, so you can see all the tables and access all the records with updates or whatever with an administrative front end. Handy to have, so we'll include that. You might use Simple Form, which is a gem to make building forms easier. Building forms is probably one of the biggest headaches you might encounter on the front end. Here you've got a selection of, there's over 20 templates for different kinds of websites that you might build. We're going to build a simple business-oriented website. And we can choose to add Google Analytics or Segment.io, if you haven't encountered it before, is a couple lines of JavaScript that get inserted onto every page and gives you access to an incredible number of metrics, tracking, analytics, services, including Google Analytics and many more. Really handy, so it's nice to have that available, but in this case I'm just going to choose none. We could deploy to Heroku with Capistrano. In this case, I'm not going to set it up for deployment. The idea of Heroku is that it's there with a students often use it to set up. And Rails Turbo Links. Anyone here a real fan of Rails Turbo Links? Anybody here dislike Rails Turbo Links? Well, Sam. The thing about Rails Turbo Links, yes, very useful. I'm glad it's in Rails, but I know a lot of developers who, when they're starting a project, want to eliminate Rails Turbo Links because it introduces a lot of headaches when you start building out your JavaScript. So much better start your basic application without Rails Turbo Links. Then when you're ready to start building your JavaScript, add your Turbo Links back in later when you've time to test each bit of it as you go along. So that's for those developers who whine and complain about Rails Turbo Links. Robust.txt file in case you roll this out onto the web and you don't want Google adding it to its index right away. You could actually set up a GitHub repository from the command line right here we'll say no to that. And once it runs, just CD into the project directory, run bundle install, Rails server, and you've got a Rails application running in less time than it took me to explain it to you. Here's what it looks like. Let me see if I can actually show you it running, since I've got it just enough time, I think. Here's the application. Let's see if it works. Because I've got network connectivity issue. Here. Oh, okay. Thank you for pointing that out. Well, while I'm fumbling with it, I'll just go back to this. Because I'm here to also talk about gems. And we could spend a lot of time, useful time, I think, having discussion about, hey, what gems are you using? What are your favorites? What do you use for this? What do you use for that? We've got other talks that we're going to have, so we can't talk about everything about gems in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But I'm going to point you to some resources where you can do some discovery, because part of the challenge of being successful Rails developer is to be a gem hunter and know where to look for the gems and how to assess gems that you could add. Because like I said, programmers are lazy. We want to borrow somebody else's code where we can. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Now, sometimes when you're evaluating gems, you may find you want to take a look Is the gem up to date? Check the GitHub repo. What was the last commit? How many issues are outstanding? Has anybody really been working and maintaining this gem? Are there any blog posts or tutorials about using this gem? And that's where you find that some gems stand out and might be preferable to others. But how do you even find out what gems are available? There's tens of thousands of gems that developers have contributed over the last 11 plus years to the Ruby community. One resource, the most current one that I'm familiar with right now, is Awesome Ruby. Awesome is this project where people set up a GitHub repo and start asking people to contribute resources that they know about. In this case, it's lists and lists and lists of gems, authentication and OAuth I see there, gems for an admin interface where the thoughtbot administrator, the Rails active admin might come in. So check out awesomeruby.com. But the Awesome Ruby project takes a couple of different forms. I don't really know the relationship between Awesome Ruby and this particular version of Awesome Ruby. These are some folks at LibHunt who I think took the Awesome Ruby curated collection of gems and resources and put a nice interface around it. This is another version of Awesome Ruby that you can check out. It gives you lists and lists of curated gems. Periodically, people will do surveys of what gems are most popular. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any survey in the last 2 years or so. The last survey that I saw that looked at what gems are most often in use in a Rails project was something that came out of the Rails Rumble, which is a really big hackathon with a big prize that was running once a year. I think it last ran in 2016. And somebody at that hackathon actually built an app where you could upload your gem file that lists all the gems in your Rails project. And it would compare your gem file with other people's gem files and then show statistics of which gems are most popular. If you get a chance to go back and look at gemsavvy.tips, it's one of those new TLDs, you'll find an interesting, they call it teardown, but comparison charts of what gems are most popular. You can see what gems people are most often using. It hasn't been running lately, but it's still probably relevant from 2 years ago. So these projects come and go. Some of you may recall a project called Ruby Toolbox that got started in the early days of Ruby. And it was a similar thing, curated list of gems in different categories. So if you wanted to find out what's a good gem for authentication, you could go to Ruby Toolbox and check it out. And then unfortunately, like many open source projects, it's run by a fellow named Christopher in Hamburg, Germany, and it was just too overwhelming. It was a tremendously useful, needed resource, and he did the best he could to keep it going and up to date. But after a couple of years ago, we started looking at Ruby Toolbox, and it just wasn't getting updated. And the reason we liked to use it so much was that it actually used the GitHub API to go out and find how many stars, how many downloads, the most recent commits, how many issues, so that you could do side-by-side comparison. And he had some nice charts that actually would show you the relative difference in the popularity of gems, which is really important because you want to know what gems are well maintained, what gems are people using the most. If somebody new comes onto your project, they may be more likely to be familiar with a device than a roll-your-own authentication solution. So Ruby Toolbox was really useful, and when it went away, I think a lot of us were really sad, and I was really, really psyched. On February 1st, found out that an organization called Ruby Together, which funds Ruby community open source projects, had noticed that Christopher was overwhelmed and provided some funding for him to take some time to rebuild Ruby Toolbox. And great news, Ruby Toolbox is back. If you remember it, if you like it, check it out. If you haven't seen it before, it's worth a look. So I'll take some questions if you have about starter applications or gems. If you want to shout out what your favorites are, any gem that you discovered recently that you think is really awesome that everybody in the room should know about, just let me know. So don't be shy if you have some questions. But any questions? Any thoughts? Anything to share? Well, I'll just say this is my Twitter if you want to follow me, and Instagram, then the Digital Nomad. Oh, great, Christopher's got me.
So you mentioned like looking at gems, and if they're not maintained, if they don't have GitHub activities, then it's probably not maintained. There's also I've seen some people comment that it's if a GitHub repo doesn't have activities, so maybe it's stable, or like that it's not that the repo, like the stars or the issues, are not a good metric for for looking at which gems to use. So aside from Ruby Toolbox, what do you think should be should we check, like when using gems, when choosing gems? Yeah.
I'll say one thing first, which is, and I didn't preface the talk by saying this, you should actually decide first whether you need a gem or not. There's a downside of gems, and the downside of gems is that you introduce a dependency into your application, of course. So, and I've seen that problem. The book, the Ruby on Rails book, used the simple form gem. The idea was it was going to simplify complexity for beginners setting up forms, and all of a sudden with Rails 5.1, forms, the forms differently now. And the simple forms gem broke. Somebody who was, unfortunately, students who didn't have a lot of support from other people got stuck with the book because some of the instructions didn't work. And this could be you on a project where, if you haven't locked down the gems in your gem file to a particular version, a new version of Rails might come out, and suddenly some of the gems you're using don't work. So don't let yourself get in that situation. Lock down your gem file. Christopher's question: how do you evaluate whether a gem is suitable for use? Yeah, you can make the argument that a really good, stable gem doesn't have any issues, but I think everyone still does. I mean, there's always going to be edge cases or some new developments where somebody's going to be raising an issue. If it's a popular gem, there's going to be open issues, and it's just a matter of looking back and seeing in the GitHub repo, are those issues being closed quickly? Are any of the issues something that's going to affect you? Unstable, well-maintained, mature gem, you're going to look at issues. There's going to be some issues open. It'll look like most of the recent issues that look like simple things have been closed pretty quickly. Maybe there's some old outstanding issues that maybe nobody cares about or seem to be an edge case or nobody's been able to reproduce. But you'll likely see issues, and it's just a matter of looking at the timestamp. How quickly have issues been closed? How often? And change logs, hopefully, if there's a change log, it shows how often it's maintained. But was that a leading question? Do you have a good answer for that yourself? Any more thoughts about gems? We wouldn't be Rails developers if it wasn't for gems. I think this is why Rails became so popular in the startup community. We wouldn't be, we'd be still using PHP or Java, and JavaScript didn't have a built-in package manager, and so it didn't have this rich ecosystem. We might have all been using JavaScript 10 or 11 years ago instead of Rails if there had been a package manager where people could work on open source projects, polish something up, release it to the community, and then everyone else could start using it. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons. Sure, Ruby is elegant. Sure, Ruby is a pleasure to work with. Rails gives us convention so that, it's a funny thing, especially coming from San Francisco, because there's so many hipster programmers. I mean, such a thing with your craft coffees and your craft beers and your vinyl records, and everybody's a nonconformist in their own individual and idiosyncratic way. But when it comes to software development, we all want to be conformists. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to bring new people onto projects and have them know exactly what we're doing without a lot of time. So we try to be conformist. And I think that's what Rails gives us, and gems also leverage that in the same way. Christopher, thank you. I want to give a shout out to the Philippines. Thank you so much for hosting me. And I've been here a year and a half, and it's been, after traveling around for over 3 years, this has been a good place for me to stay and a good place for me to work. So I want to thank everyone here for the hospitality of your country.
Thank you, Daniel. So before we go on to our last talk before lunch,